Hello, we're going to be starting a new chapter today. We're going to begin by looking at learning objectives, how to write them, how teachers use them. Then we will be moving on to look at things like teaching strategies, how expectations can affect teachers, as well as differentiated instruction. But for now, let's get started with learning objectives. You can probably tell from the format, this is one of the Adobe Presenter modules that I'm attempting to convert to a YouTube video. So let's see how it goes, and let's get started. Rather than beginning with an agenda, I thought I would start by showing you our objectives for the day, since we will be discussing how to write objectives. So by the end of this module, you should be able to explain why learning objectives are important, and also be able to write them correctly using the guidelines we have presented. Instructional planning is truly the behind-the-scenes part of teaching, and you're going to find that it is quite essential. Here are a couple of reasons why. First of all, it does provide a sense of confidence, especially if any of you have any anxiety in regards to public speaking or teaching in general. The more you plan, the more confident you're going to feel because you'll be more prepared. It helps you also to plan a guide for how you're going to get everything covered. You know, teachers always say there's too much to cover and not enough time. So you really do need to plan out your entire year to ensure that you get everything covered and in the correct way. And finally, it's going to help you with your time management. You need to work from bell to bell. You need to make sure you're filling that time well so that your classes are productive. And the better you plan, the better you're going to improve that time on task. Not for notes, but one of the key aspects of instructional planning is writing a lesson plan. These are the basic components of a lesson plan as prescribed by OU's Patton College of Education. So I just wanted you to take a moment and look at them. Our focus today will only be on one aspect of the lesson plan, and that is learning objectives. So I thought I might start by addressing the question of why. Why are learning objectives important? As an example, if you were going to build yourself a house, would you want to build that house without some sort of a blueprint? I doubt it, because building a house without a blueprint would probably end up looking something like this. We need to have a plan so that we know where we're going and what it's supposed to look like when we're done. The point being, it's very difficult to teach, and it's just as hard for your students to learn if you don't know where you're going and you don't know what you expect your students to learn. So that is why we need to think about planning. So we're going to begin by looking at why learning objectives are important, and more specifically by focusing on you, the teacher. How might they help you? First of all, they give a strong structure, an internal structure to either your course or your lesson. Because if you start off by stating what you want your students to learn, you know what the focus of that lesson should be. It helps you to make instructional decisions. It helps you to determine the content of that course. And again, that provides a more organized lesson as well. How else might they help you? Well, they also help to pair up what you're teaching with what you're assessing. You know, you want to make sure that your assessments align well with what you have taught your students. So if you have well-written learning objectives, you can use those learning objectives to help create your assessments. And I'm going to pause there. Have you ever had a class where you go to take the test and you feel like, wow, this test does not at all match what we've studied? That there seems to be a real disconnect? That tells me that that's a teacher that hasn't really done thoughtful planning, that hasn't really thought about where am I going, what do I want my students to learn, so that teaching goes in that direction and assessments go in that direction as well. And then the two flow together well. I thought this visual would be helpful, not for notes, but just to think about. So in the middle you have your student. Your learning objectives help to drive your instructional strategies. Those instructional strategies can help to guide how you're going to assess your students, which feed back into your learning objectives. It should be a very clear and well-aligned circle. What's another way that learning objectives can help you as a teacher? Well, they can help to give you consistent results. If you write down what your learning objectives are for each of your lessons, year after year, what you will find is greater consistency. Because although you might use slightly different activities or slightly different strategies, that end goal will remain the same, what you expect your students to learn. And finally, it can help to make your teaching more efficient and organized. Because again, we're always short on time and long on content and dreams. By stating your learning objectives, you can manage that time more effectively and improve your time on task.
I also want to jump in here and add something else. So this idea of organized. Remember what we learned with information processing memory model. You students learn best when the information they're given is presented in an organized way, so it can truly improve their learning.
So I thought I would pose a question. How might learning objectives help students? So think about it. How might it help a student for them to know what is expected of them or what they're supposed to learn? Let's see if we can't answer that question. It makes their learning goal-oriented. They know what they're working towards. For instance, since I presented objectives at the beginning of this module, you now know what you're supposed to get out of it. It might help you focus your learning. What else might you get out of it? Well, it can also help you monitor your own progress. If you know that the objective for the lesson is for you to be able to write a persuasive essay, then you know what it is that you're supposed to do, and you can assess whether or not you've met that. And the more specific the learning objective is, the easier it is for you to use it to monitor or assess yourself.
You can also assist this process by posting learning objectives in the classroom, by writing it at the top of their assessments, and then when they're looking at how they did on it, to think about how they did in reflection to those objectives.
What are some other ways it might help students? Well, it can help you with metacognition. This is a term covered when we discuss higher level thinking skills. Metacognition is your understanding of your own thought process, as well as your attempts to self-regulate. So if I know what's expected of me and I know what my learning objectives are, I can better evaluate how I'm doing, how I need to study, how I'm going to learn or be able to do that best. There's some key terminology that needs to be discussed. This is not for notes, but this might clarify questions you have in your head from talking with other teachers or perhaps from other courses that you've taken.
Again, I'm going to pause, and it is going to be for our notes. I've added this to our fill-in notes just to make sure we're all on the same page.
First of all, the difference between a goal and an objective. Typically, goals are much more broad. I might have goals about what I expect my students to learn across the entire year, whereas objectives are more specific, and they might be to one single day. What is my objective for today? Or perhaps my objective for the end of the week. Two other terms that you may have learned in other courses or might learn in the future are conditions and criterion. Let's see what they are. When you're writing objectives, if you want to get truly specific, you can state not only what you want the students to learn or be able to do, that is the performance, but you might also want to state the conditions being under what conditions or in what context should they be able to do this. And finally, the criterion. The criterion is where you state the level that is considered to be acceptable or the level that is considered to be mastery. So just to look at the first example, students will be able to list, that's the performance. The conditions would be without their notes, and the criterion would be they have to do at least 3 benefits of evaluation. So you can see that's a nice way of looking at specificity within your objectives. We will not be getting that specific for this type of a course, but in the future you may. So let's start to look at how do you write good learning objectives. Here's an activity that we typically do in class, but it can be just as beneficial from home with an online module. In your notes, simply write one learning objective. It could be for anything. It could be for our upcoming project. And then once we cover how to write objectives, I'm going to give you a chance to edit it. This type of activity can be quite helpful. So let's start with...
In fact, I would recommend that you try to write one for your learning vignette, your final project for the class, just so you can get an idea of whether or not you're writing them correctly, because once we cover this, we'll come back and take a look at it.
Best practices for writing.
Let me rewind. Pardon me, let me rewind and start again.
So let's start with best practices for writing learning objectives. First of all, they should be focused on the student or student-centered. So the learning objective should not be about you, the teacher. They should be about the student. What do you want the student to learn or to be able to do? Here are some examples related to student-centered. A bad example would be show students how to dribble and pass the ball. And the reason that's a bad example is because that's what the teacher is doing in the lesson, not the student. Here are some shortened but sample objectives. Take a look at them, and I want you to ask yourself which ones are student-centered. So here are the answers. Only 2 of these are truly student-centered. All of the rest focus on what the teacher is doing. Believe it or not, these were actually pulled by true learning objectives written by actual teachers. The next of our best practices states that learning objectives should be outcome-oriented. That means it should be focused on what you want your student to be able to do or what you want them to know. It should be measurable. It should use action verbs. It should not focus on the process of learning, but the end result. So here are some outcome-oriented examples. So for the bad one, students will learn how to conjugate French vocabulary. Will learn. Well, when do you know when they're finished learning? And is learning really the outcome you want? The same thing goes with other similar verbs like practicing, studying, reviewing. A better example is students will correctly conjugate French vocabulary. That's why they are learning. That's why they are practicing. So focus again on the end result. Here are some other shortened sample objectives pulled from examples that I've seen from teachers. Ask yourself which ones are outcome-oriented.
I'm going to pause to give you a little bit longer to read them. So which ones are correct? Which ones are outcome-oriented? And when I said that I pulled these from examples written by teachers, these were actually pulled off of school websites. So the schools actually posted these on these websites as if these were correct learning objectives. All right, let's continue and see.
Here are the answers. Only 2 of them are truly outcome-oriented. The rest are more about the process of learning. Even the second one from the bottom, read a novel. Is that really the end goal, just to read it and then put it down and put it away? Or is there something more you want them to attain rather than just simply reading it and getting to the end? Another one of our best practices is that your learning objectives need to be clear and understandable. So they should be well written, they should be simple, and when you read them, it should be very clear what the student is expected to learn. So I thought I would follow up with the question of why? Why do they need to be clear and understandable, and to whom? Well, they should be clear so that students know what is expected of them. So students are one of the parties. They should also be clear for a substitute teacher who might need to interpret and implement your lesson plan. They should be clear for administrators and parents. And this is also going to be helpful for when you're creating your assessment. So there are many reasons why this is important.
And the one for parents, that is especially important for the elementary grades. So if you have a child who's missed school and they're homesick and the parent's trying to help them catch up on their homework, the parent needs to be able to understand what the student is supposed to be getting out of the assignment.
Here are two examples. I just want to read the poor one to you. So, develop a deeper, more integrated understanding of biological concepts with a focus on the human system that will enable them to connect life experiences to their underlying structures and genetic physiological mechanisms. I actually pulled that from a teacher's lesson plan that I was evaluating. I'm not sure anyone would completely be able to explain in their own words what that means. So you can see the one below it is much shorter, but also perhaps more easily understood. When writing learning objectives, and this one's kind of tough, you also need to think about how specific versus how general it should be. So having the right level of generality, let me show you some examples that might help. So let's look at these. Let's start with one that's too general. Students will be able to communicate effectively. I actually have seen that on a lot of syllabi. What does that mean? I mean, that's incredibly broad. But the next one, students will be able to recognize, identify, and properly use common and proper nouns in freestanding form and in a sentence. Well, that's very specific. That might be even perhaps part of a rubric for a paper. Very, very specific. So you want to make sure that, again, you're looking at an appropriate level, like students will write a cohesive research paper with proper documentation.
Or if when you're talking about communication, you're talking about oral presentations, perhaps specify that. Or if you're talking about communicating within group work, or simply social skills, you need to, again, be specific enough that people know what it is that they're supposed to be learning, but just not too specific. So you're including every little detail, and also in this one, multiple verbs.
You also need to think about things like Bloom's taxonomy to make sure that you have an appropriate level of higher level thinking skills, not necessarily for every lesson you teach, but across your course. Here's a nice visual of Bloom's taxonomy to get you to think about how you might be able to implement all of these different levels of higher level thinking skills within your course, across your lessons, across your projects, and your exams.
I'm going to pause again. So the way this works is, here in bold, you see all of the levels for Bloom's. Above them, what you have are sample assessments, activities, instructional strategies that relate to that level. And then underneath the word are the verbs that you would use when you were writing learning objectives that typically hit at that particular level.
And then we have that learning objectives need to be developmentally appropriate. You need to make sure that you are targeting your age grade. You don't want it to be too hard. You don't want it to be too easy. You might want to even think about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development here. Again, if it's too easy, they won't learn anything. If it's too hard, you're going to cause anxiety. You need it to be right at the correct level for them to perform well.
And this is why we have standards for each grade level. Because if you get hired to teach third grade and you're teaching third grade math, you don't want to guess what third graders are supposed to do. You're going to go to those standards to get an idea of what are third graders expected to know and do. So again, those sorts of things help your objectives and your lessons be developmentally appropriate.
And then you also need to think about whether or not your objectives are specific enough and measurable enough. You know, in this world of accountability, and we have an upcoming chapter on assessment, everything has to be assessed and measured. And if you have a very vague learning objective, like students will communicate effectively, how in the world are you going to measure that? So the more specific it is, but not too specific, the easier it is to measure. So with this idea of specific and measurable, you want to consider what verbs you use. Some verbs are more measurable than others. That doesn't mean that there are certain verbs you can't use. You just want to make sure that you are writing it in a way that is specific enough for you to be able to measure it.
So I'd also like to jump in here. I used to be a consultant evaluator with the accreditation teams that would go around and visit different colleges and look for academic quality. And it was typically my job to review assessments, to review syllabi, again, academic quality. I recall visiting one school and we were consulting with them about their assessments, and for their ag program, one of their learning objectives was students will appreciate the pig. Now, again, if you don't know much about ag, you might find that kind of funny. Students will appreciate the pig. But we had quite conversations about what does that mean to appreciate the pig and how do you measure that? Because it was important for that program, but at the get-go, it does sound a bit nebulous and difficult to assess.
Okay, we have now covered all of the best practices for learning objectives. If you wrote a sample learning objective at the beginning of this lesson, take a moment and look over it. Tweak it, edit it. That simple practice can be helpful with applying these best practices.
Keep in mind, you will be writing a lesson plan for your final project in this class. And one of the things that I do, question number 1 is asking what your learning objectives are. And I always go through those to make sure, does it meet these best practices that we just discussed?
Although we've covered best practices, there are some other things we need to think about within the world of learning objectives. They should also consider what we call different domains of learning. The first one, and the one that comes to mind most often, is the cognitive domain. Cognitive domain includes what you want your students to know. You want them to know facts. You want them to know terms and concepts and theories and events, information. But that's not everything. You might also want them to have a learning objective within the domain of psychomotor skills, something that you want them to do. Maybe you want them to learn to play a musical instrument, to pronounce words in a foreign language correctly, to perform an experiment in a science class, to create an Excel spreadsheet. Okay, so sometimes it's a skill.
And there are a lot of courses that is what you're going to be teaching them. I listed a variety of examples, but that can include your art, your music, your PE. It can be part of your science courses, part of your foreign language courses, math courses. Solving problems is a skill. Let's continue.
Sometimes it's affective. Maybe it's a character trait or a virtue or a value that you're trying to teach your students. The importance of respect in the classroom. The importance of cooperation during group work. So again, learning objectives are not always just about knowledge being gained. They are about other areas as well, things that are just as important.
And think about teacher education program here at OU, professional dispositions, and the weight that we put on things like professionalism for our teacher candidates. That is entirely an affective component of our learning objectives.
I wanted to ask this question. Can you provide an example of an affective objective? You might want to draw upon when we talked about moral development and the idea of teaching morality in your classroom. You know, is respect important to you? Is kindness important? Those sorts of things might be something you want to find a way to incorporate into your class and even create learning objectives on. In the past, when I've done workshops for teachers on writing learning objectives, I've sometimes encountered this question. Does the idea of writing a learning objective somehow inhibit my creativity as a teacher? And the answer is no, no, no. Goals just help you determine what you want the students to learn, not how you're going to do it. It doesn't dictate your instructional strategies. It doesn't dictate your assessments or your homeworks or your projects. It just makes sure that we all have a similar outcome in the end. How you get there is completely up to you.
So, you could have a school that has multiple teachers, perhaps for, let's say, 7th grade. And the principal might have you have the same learning objectives in each course across all teachers. That doesn't mean each teacher is going to teach the same way or have the same types of activities or assessments in their class. They just are all trying to reach the same goal. How you get there is part of your academic freedom.
And that's it for our segment on writing learning objectives.
So thank you very much for your time, for your attention. I hope you found this helpful, and remember, you will be using this when writing your lesson plan for our final project. So thanks and goodbye.